What a week it has been. Let's get the ball rolling with what's happening now. Sort of. It was a big day this past Friday for Americans, as the American Supreme Court came to a ruling that legalized same-sex marriage nationwide. That's correct, folks. Individuals who now have a same-sex partner have the right to marriage, same as individuals with a partner of the opposite sex. The ruling came on Friday with 5 of the 9 justices voting in favor of same-sex marriage and 4 voting against. Like always, though, let's address some of the backstory. It all kind of goes back to the late 19th century when some European researchers in the branch of psychology first attempted to classify homosexuality as a disease, and homosexual behavior was considered deviant behavior. In the United States, the stance of the scientific community on homosexuality and homosexual behavior was made clear in 1952 when the American Psychiatric Association published its first diagnostic and statistical manual on mental disorders, which was also referred to as the DSM, and this DSM listed homosexuality as a disorder. This listing, however, came under scrutiny by the National Institute of Mental Health, and research consistently failed to support this finding. So by 1973, the American Psychiatric Association had homosexuality removed from the DSM as a disorder. Along with this happening, meanwhile, the American general public's attitude towards same-sex relationships steadily shifted over the last couple decades, from the majority being incredibly against to the majority of Americans being more accepting. The Supreme Court itself has reflected the majority opinion over the years in previous rulings. The first occurred 12 years ago in 2003 in the ruling in the case of Lawrence versus Texas, in which the Supreme Court struck down laws making gay sex a crime punishable by law. The second case was United States versus Windsor, which was 2 years ago, and the Supreme Court struck down a federal law denying benefits to married same-sex couples. As the views of the general public softened on homosexuality, the issue was raised over the right of same-sex couples to be able to marry, a matter that, despite public opinion mostly being in support of, it saw staunch opposition from particularly the religious community. For several years, the issue of same-sex marriage was a matter that was decided by state governments and/or state circuit courts. Eventually, after legalization in various states occurred with only an increasingly smaller minority of states remaining, the issue was brought to be decided on the national level. Which brings us to the ruling from this Friday that ruled in favor of same-sex marriage being legalized. So it's time to unveil a new segment of mine entitled Conversing About Money. Money, or more specifically, economics, plays a huge role in day-to-day life, whether it's in relation to a country's government, a large corporation, a small business, or just you as an individual. In the modern world, money makes the world go round. One of the aggravating things about discussing economics, though, is that it gets quite complex quite quickly because of all the specific terms and the complicated financial products and the terms behind them. So I try to keep it simple. Emphasis on the word try. So what's the subject of the money conversation today? The answer to that question is Greece. On Tuesday of this week, Greece could find itself with a severe money problem. It all goes back to April of 2010, when information revealed that the Greek economy had been hit by 3 distinct recessions. The first had been in late 2007, the second one lasted from mid-2008 to early 2009, and the third was in the summer of 2009. Greece's economy had a debt-to-GDP ratio raised from 109% in 2008 to 146% in 2010. Just to clarify, a debt-to-GDP ratio is a number that indicates whether an economy produces enough goods and services to pay back debts without incurring more debt. So naturally, the lower a country's debt-to-GDP percent is, the better off that country is doing. The problem with Greece in this report when it came out wasn't so much just that the number had gotten large, but how quickly and by how much that number had gotten larger. Timing also played a huge factor in how creditors responded to this report. You might remember that in 2010, the United States of America was just on the heels of recovering from what many referred to as the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. This made creditors anxious and nervous about other nations, and more specifically, concerned with countries that have high levels of debt being unable to repay their credit obligations. So the private markets and lenders downgraded the Greek government's debt to what is called junk bond status, which is a thinly veiled way of saying they don't think Greece will pay back their loans, and no reasonable person looking to see their money back should invest or loan in them. Essentially, purchasing Greek debt, or bonds, is the equivalent of buying junk. This essentially made access to private credit and loans to the Greek government inaccessible, or rather, they could technically still get a loan or take up more debt, but they would have to agree to an exorbitantly high interest rate or yield rate. In response to this, the European Central Bank and the International Monetary Fund, realizing there could be huge consequences if Greece defaulted, launched a bailout worth 110 billion euros to help them cover their financial needs between May of 2010 to June of 2013. The condition was that Greece had to implement structural reforms, privatize government assets, and implement what are called austerity measures, which would have entailed increasing taxes and reducing government benefits to prospective or current retirees, and perhaps just anyone who gets aid money from the government. Greece's government accepted this bailout, despite it being an unpopular decision for a majority of its citizens. However, a year passed and a worsened recession, along with the Greek government delaying any implementation of the agreed-upon terms of the first bailout, led them to having to get a second bailout, this time worth 130 billion euros. What were the terms this time? Well, put simply, Greece's government had to actually implement the changes it said it would from the first bailout, and creditors had to agree to lower their interest rates to the Greek government, as well as extend the time of repayment on loans currently held, and take a reduction of face value on bonds for Greek debt worth 53.5%. Essentially, a lot of concessions were made. Despite all this, in December of 2012, worsened conditions resulted in the Greek government having to get one last round of debt relief measures, along with an extra 8.2 billion euros in loans. Then, in early to mid-2014, things actually started to look up, and positive growth was shown to be occurring in Greece's economy. Greece even managed to regain access to private lending, which, at the time, was a big deal. All of these positive outcomes, however, were thrown out the window when there was another recessionary period in Greece during late 2014, as well as a snap parliamentary election being called, which led to a new government taking control, and this government refused to respect the terms of their current bailout agreement. Something important to note is that all the previous bailout funds of euros I mentioned were being given over time, not all at once. So when Greece's new government made this announcement that it would not oblige by the terms of the bailout, the groups that offered them the bailout initially could have justifiably ceased sending them the remaining portion of the bailout and hung them out to dry. Instead, having a vested interest in keeping Greece in the European Union, they sent them the portion of the bailout intended to help Greece for early 2015 and told them, or rather Greece's government, they had until mid-2015 to either agree to oblige with the terms of the old agreement or manage to renegotiate with them a mutually acceptable new agreement. Which brings us to June 30th, this Tuesday, in which, as of this Saturday, the European Central Bank has not agreed to Greece's request for a time extension to come to a decision, and Greece has to make a repayment of 1.5 billion euros to the International Monetary Fund, an obligation they might fail to meet. Greece could potentially find itself out of the European Union, and banks in Greece have even pledged to stay shut tomorrow on Monday. Only time will tell what the future holds for Greece after this Tuesday, but as of right now, it's not looking good. Alrighty, last segment, and it's not a new one, but rather a familiar one. Here's a recommendation. This recommendation is in honor of the upcoming American holiday within a near week's time of American Independence Day. The literary work in question is a fairly short poem about the American patriot Paul Revere and how he rode in the night to warn the American colonial militia of the march of British soldiers prior to the battles of Lexington and Concord. Two skirmishes that happened in 1775 that were in many ways a prelude to the American Revolutionary War, which would eventually start in earnest on July 4th, 1776, that following year. The poem is called Paul Revere's Ride by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. It was first printed in 1861 and was an immediate success. Prior to this poem's printing, the contribution and role of Paul Revere towards the efforts of the American Revolution were not well known. This poem made Paul Revere a legend among the American patriots. It's stirring poetry, and I definitely suggest you give it a read. And that's all for this installment. See you next week.